Welcome. What we're going to be doing today is looking at the Arnold renderer and seeing how we can set up scenes, how we create materials, lights, and how we render those things out. Also how to create a turntable for characters. What we're looking at right here is a example of studio lighting in Maya using the Arnold renderer, and it's just a character of mine to just experiment with what it is that I could output from there. Honestly, Arnold gives us something that I could not have imagined existing for animation students or anyone in this current generation with the computers and software. It is absolutely mind-blowing what you can get for results on some of these renders. And what we look at, I know if you're new to the game, you really don't understand render times yet, how long things take, but I'm accustomed to having to set up a render that would take 18 hours. I've had something go for 36 hours, and it didn't really deliver the results I was looking for. Arnold kind of changes that game. It's a physical based shader and renderer where the output of these things are just absolutely gorgeous, and it really changed the game for animators and visual effects artists, because now we're able to get things so much more photorealistic compared to what we were looking at just a couple years ago. So let's create a file in Maya and figure out how we actually can utilize Arnold to output our scenes. So what I'm going to do first is make sure it goes to somewhere that I actually want this to output to. So I'm going to go into my project window. Remember, this is something you should be doing every time that you are creating a project. I'm going to go to New and change that out. And let's call this one Arnold Render. I'm going to select that. That's all good. I'll hit accept. Okay. First thing I'm going to do is just drop in some geometry so we can look at those. I'm going to put in a cone. I'm going to put in a sphere. Now, by default, Maya makes a polysphere that's very, very, very low poly, so I'm just going to jump that up to about 16. Actually, you know what? Let's go 32 just for fun. Here we go. And by fun, I mean let's just get that in there. Okay. I have a sphere and a cone, and let's make a cube. Okay. Just trying to make sure these rest. Now, obviously, this is a hard thing to do if I'm looking at it from this perspective. So if I go from the side perspective and here, I can scale that up. Make sure it's kind of flush with that line. All right, that's pretty good. Let me space these out a little bit. Okay. Now, how I change this background, all I have to do is hold down Alt and B. It'll toggle those out. I kind of like this because it's fancy. Gives me a nice little gradient on there. But this is something that's very important to think about in case if you are being influenced by the color of the blue, maybe turn that off. So we just have solid black, gray. It's really up to you guys. All right. So I have this. I'm going to go ahead and go into my material editor. And right inside of press tab to create node, I can actually go into right on the side. See this? Under Arnold, I can click surface. There's a lot of different ones that are there. And you can just drag one of these out into here, or I usually just start with a standard surface right here. So I have a standard Arnold surface. Notice when I did that, it popped up inside of here. And let's give it a new color. Give that like a greenish color. I'm going to duplicate that. I'm going to make this one red. Make it a little brighter. And for this one, let's go blue. All right. Now, I'm just going to middle mouse button drag those to my objects on the scene. So middle mouse button drag, middle mouse button drag. For some reason that one didn't catch, so there. Same material, there we go. Okay, so we've got 3 colors, and they all have that same shader on there. Now all I did was adjust the color. There's a lot of other stuff we'll talk about in a second, but let's see how that looks. I'm going to press render, and right now this is the Arnold renderer, and it can't really see anything. It's really dark. That's okay if you see this. By default, you're probably going to see stuff in software. It's going to look like this. And you'll notice it's just solid colors. Because my software within Arnold material that we just added cannot see that. So we're going to have to go back to the Arnold renderer. I'm going to close this, and I'll have to set up some lights to be able to see these things. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to go back to my modeling ribbon. Sorry, not the, yep, the menus here. So just to drop down, go to modeling, and then I'm going to go to Arnold, and I'm going to go to lights and create an area light. You'll notice some stuff that we talked about last time, the point light and a couple of other lights, they're just not there. So area light is actually your default light that Arnold likes to use. And if I take this thing and drag it out, I have a light, and you'll notice it's not showing me anything. Well, the first thing we have to do is go to renderer, and instead of being in Viewport 2.0, we're going to click on Arnold with a square. And let's see, where is, there we go. So we just have to click the drop down on that. Now press the play button. All of a sudden now we have a representation of what Arnold would do for us when we hit the render button. And I found this to be quite accurate. It's pretty amazing what our real-time view is capable of doing. Now, the more complicated your scene is going to be, the longer it's going to be for this thing to catch up, and it depends on the video card you have. I have a GeForce 1080 card, so it catches up pretty quickly. If you have a laptop, it's probably going to take a lot longer for updates to occur. But you'll notice that if I move this across the screen, this will start to move, and at first it seems a little bit fuzzy, and as it is let go of the movement and it starts to kind of figure out what's going on there, it actually gives a pretty accurate detail of that reflection of that light in the scene. So that is something to consider. The more complex you have of stuff in here, the longer this is going to take to update. So you'll notice when I created a light, I went into the Arnold lights. I did not go into my rendering lights. These lights we should completely just kiss goodbye. That's not what we'll be using when we use the Arnold rendering system. So just be aware of that. I know I'm going to have to say that 800 times in class. Hopefully this video alleviates that issue. So I have this one light, and let's go into the light settings here. It's going to be underneath our attribute editor. And we have color, intensity, exposure, spread, roundness, soft edge. We'll talk about a couple of these as we go. So the first thing I'm going to do is go with my intensity. If I crank that up, you'll notice right away that my light is feeding my scene. It's lighting that a lot more intensely than it was, obviously because it's called intensity. So I'm at 8.182. Not that that's a number that matters. I'm just using the slider to adjust that. You'll notice that exposure really get things to kick off here. I'm going to leave that alone for now. So you can notice we have our intensity and exposure that we can start to mess with. Now, watch what happens if I mess with color temperature, and it might be helpful. Let me just quickly create one more thing in here. Okay. Now you notice when I had this new object added, our light disappeared. That's something that happens with the Arnold renderer. So if you can't find it, I knew it was over here, so I just clicked and dragged, found it. I can go over to my outliner and just have that selected. I'm also going to add a ground plane so we can actually see this thing. Okay. Now, watch what happens if I check this box, use color temperature. Okay. Right now, we're kind of in a white light color. If I drag this over towards the lower values, it gets more reddish orange. If I drag this over to the higher temperatures, it becomes blue. So that's kind of cool because that's exactly how lighting works in the real world. And it's extremely helpful because we can actually get some pretty realistic light settings right by adjusting this. So for the color temperature. Now, if you don't want to deal with the color temperature, we can also go into color up here, select a color, and then there we go. We have a light color there as well. I'm going to leave this alone for now. I just want to go through some other stuff here. Now, my light shape is set as a quad. You might notice under Arnold, underneath the lights, oh no, spotlight is not there. Well, Arnold utilizes a area light that we can now turn into a disc. And by doing that, we can actually have that kind of behave in a similar methodology that a spotlight would be. Or we can actually do a couple other things. So we can also, let me get rid of that one cylinder because I don't need it. Okay, I have that. I'm going to watch what happens to the edges of my box here. Under roundness, I'm going to drag that upwards. And it might, there we go. Let's see if we can have, might be hard to see on this. The box doesn't really change. However, the roundness of our shape allows for me to have it behave a little bit more like a spotlight. So let's see if we bring this down. You'll kind of notice that behaving more like that, a square. And it's not really easy to see on there. So just be aware that that is an easy way to adjust these things for a spotlight. Now, let's see here. Underneath our samples, this will increase render time if we increase our samples. But what that'll also do is allow for Maya to be able to sample more numbers of rays that are being cast and be able to actually see this in a more refined render. That's also going to increase our render time. That is the thing we're constantly fighting against. Now you'll notice I have cast shadows on, but I don't see them in here. That's because we have to go into our lighting and have our my shadows is grayed out for some reason right now. But there is a way under use all lights. There we go. That's it's on now. So default use all lights. I've switched that to, and now shadows. And shadows will start to be filling out on here. All right. So doesn't look like shadows is doing too much for me yet. But let's keep going here. If you don't see it here, let's see what happens if we hit the render button. Now, what I'm going to make sure I do first, before I start to render things out, I know from experience, and you should know this too, that time is very precious, and you don't want to sit there and wait for something to render out for forever to get nailed down. You want to kind of experiment with things. Right now I have this set to HD 540. That's a little bit better to test things out with instead of 1080. That's just going to take a lot less time to mess with. So right now this is just a 540 render. It took me 5 seconds. If I did that in 1080, you're probably looking at around 15 seconds or so. So be aware of that. We're just experimenting right now. So if I have this area light again, and I start to mess with this. So I'm going to bring this up. There's our shadows finally showing up now. It just took a little while for that to update in our render. Okay, so I have one light here, and it's not super exciting. Remember that if you don't like how lighting feels kind of robotic, you can always go into panels, look through selected, and this is actually going to be your light that you're looking through, so it's very helpful to kind of zero in on what you're supposed to be looking at here. I'm going to go back to my perspective here. Alright, so I got that first light over here. I'm actually going to use color temperature. I'm going to use that as a kind of orange color over here. Now this light is kind of hard to see because it just disappeared. Let's see, there we go. This light is kind of small. I can actually scale that up, and by doing so you'll notice that those reflections get bigger, but it also does impact how bright things will be, so something to be aware of as well. I'm going to keep this. I'm going to actually duplicate that light now and move it over. So now I have two lights. I'm going to move this behind my scene. And I'm going to make it more rectangular. And hopefully get it so I can get some rim lighting here. So I'm going to change my color temperature to blue, and let's wait for this to update. Maybe that's not going to be 100% what I'm looking for, so maybe expanding that out again like that. Now I've got rim light on both of these. So let's see what happens if I hit the render button. Okay, now that first render time was what, 3 seconds? Now it's 5 because we've added another light on there. Remember, this is what happens with rendering. The more stuff you have, the more time it's going to take to adjust. Alright, so I have two lights in here. My intensity, I could always drop that down if this is a secondary. My primary should be the one that's actually lighting up the scene the most intensely, so I'm just going to crank up my exposure there. I'm going to hit render again. And I'm going to move my cube over in a second so that way we can actually see this without overlapping the cube and the cone. But that's looking a little bit better. Now, if I want to keep seeing what happens from render to render, I'm not sure why this is doing a spinning ball of death here, but hopefully I can do this. So yeah, I'm still able to move. But right here, this little button here will save my frame, so that way I can compare and contrast it with something else. I'm going to move this over, and then now I'm going to see if I can grab that light. I'm going to increase the intensity a little bit more and go a little bit deeper with my temperature and bring up this, render it again. Okay, there's the new render. Now I can save that by pressing this button, and now I can go back and forth and compare and contrast the two scenes. This is extremely helpful. Now we did talk about 3-point lighting. We did talk about how to output those as a play blast, but I do want to show you a couple other features with Arnold here. This is getting there. It's starting to look pretty interesting, but this is very boring for material. If we go back into our hypershade, I'm going to select just the green right here. This Arnold preset is just the AI standard surface. I can go into balloon, blood, brushed metal, bubble, car paint. I'm a blood guy. I love blood. Let's put that in there. Okay, so this is actually trying to represent this sphere as blood. Now, We'll see if that actually works. Let's change our cone. I'm going to change this to, yeah, sure, bubble. See if that works. So we'll go bubble, replace. And now all of a sudden that cone is, you can even see in real time, it's disappeared. Okay. Let's try this next one. I'm going to go into clay. Cool. So now you'll notice each one of these now has a complete different material property on here. And if I hit render on this, that doesn't look bloody, but it's kind of an approximation. So I'm going to save this again, and I'm going to move this back. You'll notice that the default lighting, or the default material that we had on there was 6 seconds, 6 seconds for rendering. The new one cost an extra second for rendering. Now you might be thinking, big deal, that's 1 second. That's not any problem. Well, imagine that you have 24 frames per second, you have a 3-minute animation, you have something that now it takes 6 seconds, now it takes 7 seconds. Obviously 1 second will add up over time, and so we want to constantly be thinking about the pros and cons of utilizing different materials, different lights for what our output is going to do. 1 second's not that big of a deal, but if it's 15 seconds, holy cow, per frame, that's a lot. So let's go into some other stuff. So I have these three that I've tried out. Obviously blood is probably something we shouldn't be using for our default stuff. I'm going to turn the sphere now to brushed metal, and you can replace it or you can blend this. I'm just going to use replace for now. That's a whole nother discussion. So now the sphere is brushed metal, and I'm going to change my cylinder from being a bubble to some car paint, and now I'm going to change my clay for the cube. I'm going to change that to let's say gold. So holy cow, let's see what happens here. This is amazing. The fact that you have access to materials like this and can render at this time, this is absolutely something that you should be extremely thankful for. Before this, these type of renders would take forever. So you'll notice, depending on each of the different types of materials, it influences how long that render time is. Again, that was a 7 second. Now we drop down to a 4. Even with the default, because of the use of reflections on some of these, it was a 6 second. So each material is going to be different in how it influences our render. Now that cube kind of looks bad with the gold on there, so I'm going to drag that to that sphere, and let's see what happens now. Already you can already see how that's different. So okay, that's a lot better. Now let's say 4 seconds is something you just don't have time for. Click and drag across your scene. It'll light up in red. And now if we were to change something, so let's say that we're going to change out that sphere. So I'm going to change that sphere to, I have no idea what orange juice is going to do. It did this. So I'm going to add that to the sphere now. And now I'm going to just press this button. This is going to render the region. And it's not going to take as long because it's just one section. And that took 2 seconds to render. So that means the whole render is going to be a little bit longer than that, obviously. It's about 6 seconds there. And again, we can compare and contrast each one of these different setups. And it's not fair that I'm comparing these because I did move the camera accidentally on this one, and it's a good idea to lock down a camera while we're doing these tests to get a full comparison. How we'll be able to lock down a camera: if I go into rendering and I put in a camera, Let's bring that out. And let's go now to camera 1. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit so I have both of my objects right here. Alright, to prevent myself from messing this up, I'm going to go into my translate, rotate, and scale, all that. Just right click, or left click, drag down. Now right click, and we can lock it. And now we shouldn't be able to move or do anything to this. That's awesome. You can't screw up the scene. Now every time that you do a render test, it's going to be the same perspective and not screw up for you. Okay. Wow, that looks amazing. So, other things to consider when we're rendering with Arnold. Right now, if I go to my render settings, Arnold is telling me that under the Arnold renderer, my camera AA is set to 3. Now, I'm going to change that. So I've got this, I'm going to drag it down to 1. And now I'm going to render this again. So I'm going to save this image and render. Notice how much faster that was. That was 1 second. From 7 seconds to 1 second. Now notice how much grainier it got. That's because the sampling has been dropped and it's calculating it at a lesser quality. Now for our class, I'm okay if our render times are going up too high for us to get to a 1. But be aware, if you're sitting there waiting for a render and it's taking forever for the renders to go, we shouldn't be waiting for something that takes a minute long per frame. I'm sorry. That's an absolute waste of our time. So if we drop our camera AA to 1, that'll help. If we go up to 2, that's looking quite nice. That's at 4 seconds here. Now, if I tell you to do it at 2, you're going to get 4 seconds. That's absolutely not true. It depends on your scene geometry. It depends on the lighting in there. It depends on motion. So it really is something you just, as a animator, you need to be aware of when you're rendering. So this is 4 seconds at a 2 AA, 1 second at a 1 AA, and 7 seconds at a 3. So this looks pretty good. Now, obviously, for demo reel purposes, we can re-render these things out, take longer for it, but for our class, it is fully acceptable to even give me something like a 1. I'm okay with that. Okay, so I've got some lights, I've got some renders going on here. How do I actually get the materials that are there? How do I get this thing output? Well, I've got nothing here to output. If I had an animation, I can go into my common, and I could also change my format and my name, and change the camera, and we're going to do all that in a second. But we need to make sure that we go through all these steps. If we don't change our render settings, you're going to be wondering what it is that you had rendered and try to find where that was located. That is not good. So what I'm going to show you how to do is a very quick camera turnaround. And first I'm going to get rid of this light that this camera, because I don't need that. I'm going to go into my animation, visualize, create turntable, and I'm going to check that box. And my number of frames, 24 frames, that's around almost a minute. A second. That's not enough for me, so I'm going to go 360, which is a little bit more efficient, I'd say, for a turntable. If I hit apply on that, okay, notice this error that came up, this red error. This is telling me that my animation turntable needs subjects to frame before it makes a turntable. And what a turntable is, it sounds exactly like what it is. It's a rotating object where whatever's in front of the camera rotates around that object, and we get a turnaround of our scene. And that's extremely helpful for modelers. If you're going to be a modeler for either weapons or characters or set pieces, you'd usually do turntables for your portfolio. So if I have these selected and I go to my turntable, hit apply, you'll notice all of a sudden I have in my outliner this group that has a turntable camera. So I'm actually going to go to Panels, Perspective, Turntable Camera. It's actually built off of the camera that you're currently looking at the objects from. And if I hit play, okay, that's not doing what it's supposed to do. See if we can get that to work again. Oh, my renderer is dying. That's why. Arnold sometimes can't catch up and it won't update. So let's see if we can get, we're going to go back to Viewport 2.0 while we do this. Perspective. These are selected. Visualize. Make sure we have it set to 360. Hit apply. Close. Open this up. Make sure we're looking through the turntable camera. And there we go. So Arnold was not updating, and it just looked like it was hovering there, which is super awkward. The visualizer just wasn't able to keep up with it. So going back to Viewport is fine. So render Viewport. So we have this. I'm going to hit play. And now I'm rotating around my object, and oh, wait a minute. I said 360. Well, that's because it's not going to change your final frame. We just have to input that to make it match up. Now it should rotate all the way around our object and be a turntable. You notice actually it's starts slow and we'll slow down at the end. Okay, nice turntable. I like it. How do we output this thing? For the sake of time, I'm going to go into my settings and make sure if it's going to be Arnold, I'm going to drop that down to 1. I'm going to make sure my file name, let's say I'm going to call this turntable so I can find it more easily. EXR is something that is a new standard, and this is going to open up in After Effects. So when we compile our scenes, we'll be able to do that. And in the next video I'm going to provide for you, it's how to assemble your images and how to reduce your video files. We'll look at that in the next video you'll have for this class. Everything else is looking okay here. My renderable camera, I only need this to be turntable camera 1. So if you hit the trash box, it'll get rid of the other one. That's all good. And single frame, sorry, forgot about that part right here. Frame animation, we need to change this to being like name underscore number dot extension. If you don't do that, it's just going to render out one image, and it could render out that image over and over and over again. So you might be looking at 360 frames of that same image, or it just keeps repeating and you only have one image that's saved over. So that's likely what's going to happen. It's just one image that saves itself 360 times, which is maddening. So make sure you change your frame animation to name underscore number extension. We're going to go up to 360 on that. Alright, I'm going to keep this alone, and I'm going to close that. Now I'm going to go under animation, rendering, render sequence. That's looking good. Now, let's find out where that was supposed to go to as well. It says it's going to go to Maya Demos, Arnold Render, New Project Images. That's where it's supposed to go. That's why it's super, super important to make sure that you are saving your files correctly with the proper names, and you are setting up projects. If you don't do this, you have no idea where the heck your stuff went to. As a matter of fact, if you are outputting to the student drive, so your server, it likely won't send to there. Save it to a hard drive that is physical and local, and then move your stuff over later. Okay, this is looking good. I'm going to press render sequence. Now we got to wait for it to catch up, and there it goes. This is outputting all of our files right now. And I know that that's happening because if I go into my demos here and my Arnold render images, there they are. They're currently writing. This is how we create our renders. Now I'm going to also open up After Effects. So we are currently at frame 45. We got a little bit of time to go. While this is playing or setting up, there we go. So this is, it's currently rendering. So Maya's going to keep cranking away at that. I'm going to let it keep going. As it's doing that, I'm going to have a quick discussion about After Effects. This is After Effects. It's not super scary. Just know, to be able to get our images to be able to turn into a video, we bring those into After Effects instead of going and just utilizing Maya's output to video. The reason why we do this is because when we output to video using Maya, it makes for a relatively bad experience for the viewer due to the fact that things are compressed. Now, compression, we've all seen videos that seem really compressed. It looks grainy, it looks fuzzy. We don't want that, especially if we're putting stuff in for a demo reel. So what we'll do is use After Effects. And we don't even need to know too much about After Effects for this class. What we need to know is how to import our files. So underneath projects, I could have gone through all sorts of other things and made a new composition, all this other stuff. I'm just going to right click over here. If it doesn't work, you can always go to File, Import, File. I'm going to go underneath the projects I was working on. So my demos, the Arnold renderer, and under images, there's my files. If I have the first one selected, you'll notice automatically it says Open EXR Sequence. Yes, that's what we want to do. We want this to be a sequence that we're referencing. We don't want to, or importing, we don't want this to be one image, we want it to be a lot of them. If this is checked off, it's only going to be one image that comes in. So we want this, and what it's going to do is take all these other pieces and make it into a video. So I'm going to hit import. Now I have this. I'm going to drag this into my timeline. And if I hit spacebar, this green bar is filling up, and it looks really awkward. The reason why it's happening is because my CPU is currently working towards rendering out all those video files, and it's not currently able to process the update for the renderers. But as you notice, it's putting together that video really well for me because it's a sequence. Now, you should only do this step after Maya's done spitting out our videos. Right now, we're at frame 240, so we still have a ways to go before we're done with our animation. But for the sake of showing you how we output video, this is pretty helpful. So I'm going to go ahead and have this. Let's say this is what I wanted. We go to Composition, Add to Adobe Media Encoder. By doing that, it's going to open up yet another thing. It's this one right here. This is how we'll output the file, and we'll actually have a video to be able to see. Okay. Right now it's telling me this is not the one. Let's wait for this to show up. It might be just because my CPU is taking a little bit of time. There we go. There it is. So this one we can just remove. I'm going to right click and hit to remove. This is the one that we were working on. The turntable. I'm going to press the preset button. I'm going to change that one. Give me a second here. I don't know why it's looking for this. It might be because it's still drawing off of Maya's stuff. Let's see. There we go. Okay. So this popped up. This is going to show us what that final output is going to look like. This H.264 is what we should search for. Make sure H.264 is selected. Now, we can also do a preset of YouTube 720p. That'll compress it down a little bit further. I don't have audio, so I can check that box off. I'm going to check on maximum render quality. And my output name is turntable.mp4. This is to go. I'm going to put that under movies for my project. Movies, turntable, I'll have that. That's fine. Save. Now my output is going to go there. And I'll hit OK. Alright, everything else is set up correctly. So if I just press the play button, you'll see this move forward. And now that that's done, remember, this is, I referenced this in before all those frames were in there. So now that those are in there, it'll rotate all the way around. But for the sake of saving time, I pulled that in when it was only up to about 204 frames or something. So it's not going to go all the way around. However, from images, I'm going to go to new project and videos. Sorry, movies. There it is. How big is that file? It is 13.8 megabytes. Awesome. And here is that turntable. Now, yes, that looks pretty grainy. If we had that AA set up to a higher number, we wouldn't have this issue. But for the sake of render times, that's okay for me right now. Alright, so I have this output, and yes, it didn't complete all the way around because it didn't reference in all of the frames. But you can see how that works. And that's how we get a Maya file from Arnold into After Effects and output.